Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Communications at SBAM. And I want to start off by welcoming one of our new members. They are GR Select Services out of Byron Center, and they are a new VIP member. So thanks for joining and welcome to all of our new members. All right, so Brian, there's a lot happening very quickly. The news cycle is definitely keeping us on our toes. And just want to remind everybody that we do watch and keep track of it to bring it to you in this briefing. So let's start broadly and then we'll zoom back in here in Michigan. And let's start with the executive order on tariffs. You mentioned last week it was kind of conspicuously absent from the flurry of the opening executive orders in the first week, but that has now changed.
It sure has. We saw an executive order that singled out three countries in particular. This is kind of technically the second tariff issue that has came up. Colombia being the first. That was more of a retaliatory response to them not accepting a plane landing to bring individuals back from the United States to Colombia. So there was like a bit of a dust up, but I think ended up being a precursor in the issue with respect to the US's three largest trade partners. So the United States, number one, two, and three, which kind of trade off in terms of who's number one, two, and three. China and Canada and Mexico, and so China set in the executive order at 10%. That's the one I think most likely to stick. And then Mexico um, and uh, and Canada at 25%. Although we've already seen kind of a backing off of the tariffs and with respect to Mexico, and so one thing is kind of interesting, I think it bears pointing out. SBAM had been lightly involved in some of the discussions, especially the small business chapter on the USMCA. So the agreement that was the renegotiated agreement for the NAFTA trade agreement that happened during the Trump administration's first term. And in that time, we really did learn a lot about a lot about the system. And there was one thing that kind of stuck out was that it was free trade, but with quotas. And so for example, with agricultural products sold into Canada, there's no tariffs until you hit a quota, and then anything over that quota comes with tariffs that do ramp up pretty big. In some cases, 200 to 300%. So it is the relation. There's always been these points, kind of like sticking points, with respect to these trade agreements, but this one being a U.S. kind of more across the board one. It's a new chapter in these types of trade negotiations, and one that I think has not settled yet, given the fact that it's kind of an opening volley from the new administration, and as we saw with Colombia and Mexico already, pretty quick pullbacks from that based on negotiations on other issues.
So what do we know about the demands being made of Canada, Mexico, and China?
I think they're different between those two. I'd put it different groups. So there's Canada, Mexico, and then there's China. I think with China, it has a lot to do just with the idea that it's a rival superpower, and one that is kind of grown off the U.S. market for a long time, and so that's kind of set that aside for a moment. With Canada and Mexico, it seems to be very clearly tied to control of the northern and the southern border. So both of those countries are much more, it's much easier for people to get into those countries and then enter the U.S. Over those borders, as opposed to going to the U.S. through the normal legal channels. And so the expectations apparently are quite high. I know the Canadian government had made some statements uh, weeks ago that they were trying to be responsive to the concerns, and obviously it didn't reach whatever threshold President Trump was looking for. Now, the Mexican government, on the other hand, did respond very quickly to to some demands, and it has to do with guarding the southern border from the Mexican side of the border. So there was the fairly new Mexican president had committed to about 10,000 troops, National Guard troops on that border. And so you could kind of see the way this is playing out, that well, on the one hand, you might think that it's about, tariffs and trade and cheap labor versus US, the cost of US labor, that sort of thing. Those are the normal parts of the trade debate over the years. But in this case, it does seem to be very much tied to security at the border, and then also the drug trade, fentanyl in particular, and some commitments in looking at stopping both illegal crossings and the drug trade. So there's the tariffs with respect to Mexico have not been canceled, but rather put on hold for 30 days. And this is actually reminiscent of what of the agreement with the Colombians straight away in the first week of the administration. So I do believe that there's a call of some sort between the prime minister in Canada and the president going to happen today, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not there's a quick resolution or pause, as there was on the Mexican side of the border. I would say that the Canadians definitely appear more strident than in their response to these actions, announcing retaliatory tariffs of their own, and also canceling some provinces, canceling contracts of U.S. Companies as well. So a little more aggressive posture from the northern part of the border with the Canadians, but I wouldn't be surprised if there, because everybody has so much at stake here, if there is some sort of an agreement that is reached to at least give a little more time to work out a more permanent landing. But it does appear that it really doesn't have much to do with trade. It has more to do with border security and control of the drug trade.
There's been a lot of criticism and concern expressed over these policies. So Brian, why do you think he's taking this risk?
There's really, I think it comes down to two things. With the tariffs on China, I think it's a different type of concern. It's more of a broad national security concern, that the U.S. market is essentially financing the U.S.'s biggest rival, and has for a couple generations now, and a desire to change that balance, to do something to kind of slow that process that has been happening. With Canada and Mexico, about 90% of their exports go to the U.S. That's so much. Whereas like the U.S. exports into those two countries, it's about 5%. So I think that from the U.S.'s standpoint, like they're kind of looking at it like it's not as much risk as what is kind of advertised, that there's such a big inordinate type of an impact that, well, if 5% of goods from either of those countries, there's some impact on in the U.S. It's not that on our exports, not that big of a deal compared to what they'll experience, and therefore they would acquiesce more quickly. But I also think that it is it's an opening volley. It's a different type of governance and probably not a surprise to very many people, but a different type of governance than what you see, to kind of start with the end and then to kind of back off from that. And so if that is the governance strategy moving forward, I think you probably will, people will just kind of get used to a little more dramatic tone of things. But it will be important, I think, for people to not make decisions based on the opening volley, to base on the kind of the turmoil or the uncertainty that comes with the beginning steps, to let the dust settle, evaluate later on how things landed, and then make decisions with more information. Again, it's a different type of an environment, but it's one that I think pretty reasonably you can expect that you're gonna need to adjust the thinking in terms of how quickly to react to things to the extent that they're going to impact you. Now, I say all that, but Michigan does have a special risk factor in this, and that is the integrated nature of the automotive supply chain. It's different than the nation as a whole in the risk. I gave those stats in terms of the trade dependence between the two countries. That's the nation as a whole. Michigan in particular, though, we do have there's a possibility that if you have a supply chain disruption somewhere, that it could shut down other operations up or down the supply chain. And so there could be, if there are to be negative impacts, then you would expect that they probably in the automotive supply chain would show up in Michigan in a way that's more substantive than say uh, in the Southeast or in Texas or something like that. So um, this is I think there will be an adjustment period here. The market will find an equilibrium wherever it lands. The market will find a new place to rest. And once you have that information, it's probably going to be the best time to make a decision how to respond to it.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit, but stick with federal issues. Our new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has recently traveled to Central America. And we've heard in the news, it's been widely reported that the president does want to control the Panama Canal once again. So help us understand the history here and what's at stake.
Yeah, this is it's interesting to see the Panama Canal back in the news. Like when I was in grade school and middle school, I remember the Panama Canal was something we really learned a lot about, but it's not something that people pay much attention to anymore. So just by way of history, the U.S. And uh, the what would be today the Army Corps of Engineers. I mean that the process of constructing the canal was something that other countries, I believe it was France, that first tried to do it and failed at it, and then the U.S. a little more 100 years ago completed it. And really controlled. It was this, essentially saves you like 8,000 miles of going around South America when it comes to shipping lanes. And it was 1977 when there was a treaty reached to turn over control of the Panama Canal to the government in Panama. And then that was a longer term process, took a couple decades. It completed in 1999. And now since then, there has been an ongoing discussion within the U.S. about growing Chinese influence over the Panama Canal. And while they don't control the lock system itself, they do control the major ports on both sides of the Panama Canal. And so there's been some other uh, pretty intense investments in things like energy supply, that a lot of things that kind of indirectly could control the Panama Canal. Now, over 70% of the traffic that goes through the Panama Canal is either coming from or going to the United States. So it could be any sort of disruption there could be a major disruption for the U.S., but it's also a major channel that the U.S. military uses. And so like getting ships, especially warfighter ships, from one place in the world to another place in the world, that is a really important passage. And so it's viewed differently. These other things that we're talking about, like um, with with respect to um, the southern border and the northern border of the U.S. and tariffs on Chinese goods. This is different. This actually touches all those trade issues, but also an important national security issue. So it's been talked about a lot, but not so mainstream like it is right now. And so the new Secretary of State did go and at least secured an agreement among the government in Panama to cancel some agreements with the Chinese government or a Chinese government-owned company with respect to controlling a lot of the activity as it enters into the port. And it was, I think, a pretty important first step toward it. So it's been fascinating to see the Panama Canal back in the news after an absence for quite some time. But from a national security and trade standpoint, The Panama Canal has never become unimportant. It's just something that I think has been generally taken for granted. It is a marvel that that was built. The way it works is pretty fascinating as well. But it's something that I expect that ultimately it's going to be in everybody's interest to find a good landing place on that, and and the and whether or not it comes, how much further than the discussion and what has already been reached today does it go? That's a good question. I don't know whether or not the Trump administration will be satisfied with this early agreement or if there's more that will be expected. One other thing, Sarah, I was going to point out is that you notice the um, the response from the Chinese government has been very muted compared to other governments, especially Western governments, in response to something that, the Canadians very offended, and, kind of a response of like a determined, defiance and strident type of a response. The Chinese government's response has been quite muted. And but culturally, that makes sense because their view on things is much, much longer. So there are plans in terms of like, where do we want to get in 100 years? So a single US administration is a very, very short thing to wait out for a for a government that has proven that their strategy that carries out over decades is well served by simply letting certain things go and then picking up later on. It's one of the things that makes the growth of that country in relation to the United States a much bigger economic and superpower type of a threat than any other country, is because frankly, their patience.
All right. Patience is a virtue, right? All right, let's talk about another change that was put on the table for the auto industry related to cafe standards. What impact might they have on Michigan?
So the CAFE standard is just a reminder. That's an acronym. So it stands for Corporate Average Fuel Economy. And it's you saw in the last election, there was this debate on whether or not there was a mandate for electric vehicles. And so one side saying there is a mandate, and the other side saying there's no mandate. And depending on how you look at it, both could be correct, or at least technically correct. But the way the CAFE standards work is it's a regulation that requires that the fleet of vehicles that a car company like, say, Ford or General Motors produces and sells in the US, that they must meet certain fuel efficiency standards, and those became so high you couldn't meet them without having a mostly electric fleet. And so there's a long and kind of difficult process to change CAFE standards. And so they changed, and they were backed off during the first Trump administration, and it took almost the first term to go through the process to get them backed off. In the Biden administration, they ratcheted them up, but it took a lot of that term of the Biden administration to ratchet them up. Now the process is starting to for them to fall back. And now an administration that's already been there, done that, is probably going to be a little more efficient in doing it. So maybe it won't take 3 years like it did last time to make the changes. But I do expect that you'll see a significant rollback in the fuel economy mandate around the fleets of vehicles that are sold in the US. What that probably means is that there'll be fewer changes, or the changes will happen more slowly, that are happening in the industry. Because one thing that became very clear over the last few years is that you saw a ramp up of electric vehicle options that exceeded the demand within the population. There still is growing demand in the population. That's actually quite clear. It's just that the mandates of the government was exceeding that by a pretty significant amount, and so it probably means that that production and design of vehicles will fall back to something that more closely mimics what people's preferences are, and which will probably generally shift more to electrification over time, just not as quickly.
All right, let's move on to some state issues. I'm sure everybody's kind of interested to know if there's anything happening with the Earned Sick Time Act and the tipped wage credit.
Well, the bills that came over from the House have been sitting in the Senate, and then there's some Senate proposals that were more modest. We are hearing some rumblings about some activities, some willingness to do something, and but not at this moment, not clear how much and how substantive. We've always known that the Senate was a steeper hill to climb as compared to the House. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of signals quite yet about what issues that they're willing to address in terms of our concerns and the small business community's concerns, except for with just one exception. And that one exception is that the idea of a small business exemption is seems to face pretty steep odds. The Senate Majority Leader herself has mentioned that that's a line, and she doesn't want to do any small business exemption. We will continue to carry the message of why that is so important, especially for newer businesses and micro businesses where these types of mandates can have such an inordinately high impact on newer businesses and micro businesses. And so if we want to have a robust startup uh, ecosystem in our state, it's going to be really important that we allow people to start up without the government on their backs straight away. And so we'll see how far we can get with it. So discussions, and we're hopeful that something can still happen. But here we are, we're 18 days away, and the time is growing very, very short.
I'll just put in another plug for the series that Brian, you and our Director of Human Resources, Scout Sparks, have been doing on understanding ESTA and kind of giving some compliance tips. We do have two more scheduled. One is this week, Thursday morning, I think at 8:15 a.m. And then there's another one next week, I think on the 11th. So sbam.org/events. If you have not attended one of these yet, it really is a good way to kind of familiarize yourself with what will need to be implemented on the 21st. All right, anything new on the Corporate Transparency Act?
Nothing on the Corporate Transparency Act. We are still in the waiting game. So that means that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, and the IRS, they're still respecting a lower court decision that put a stay on or an injunction, I should say, on the enforcement of the law. So it's not being enforced. Nobody has to do anything yet. The And then in terms of our case, where we're looking for a decision at any point, I keep on saying it. I wouldn't be surprised if it was today, but I've been saying that for a month now.
Well, I'm going on vacation next week, so it'll happen then. I'll just put my prediction out there right now. All right, let's wrap things up and talk about the 2026 election. And last week there was a really significant development with the surprise announcement that Senator Gary Peters would not be seeking re-election. So what was the reaction there? And are we going to add 2026 Senate Watch to our list of topics?
You know, an open Senate seat is more rare than an open governor's seat. And that's because of term limits, of course, that apply to the governor, but not to the U.S. Senate. And it changes the landscape substantially. First, I want to express how unusual this is. So 1916 was the first time that the voters directly elected senators. Before that, the state legislature chose who the senators were. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, never. This is the first time ever that there has been an open governor seat and an open U.S. Senate seat at the same time, 2026. So this will be a brand new thing for the U.S. or for Michigan, first time since direct elections of senators. This is I can't overstate how big an impact this has on the political landscape within Michigan. So a lot of these people, whether they're in Congress or in the state legislature or hold statewide offices, are now contemplating whether or not it's the right move for them to run for the U.S. Senate. I'm telling you, nobody saw this coming. And if, those are like, oh, I knew Peters wasn't going to run for reelection. I just don't believe it. I mean, unless it was Colleen Peters that was saying that, I don't believe it. This was a very, very big surprise for observers around the country and especially around our state. Automatically, though, it set off a lot of speculation: who's going to be in, who's going to be out. I made some notes here I wanted to share with you. First, you've heard me talk about, I'll start with the Democrats. So Pete Buttigieg, who's the U.S. Department of Secretary, was the U.S. Department of Secretary, Department of Transportation Secretary under Biden, who lives in Traverse City. Um, he was, people were speculating is going to run for governor. He's ruled that out now, but he has indicated he's looking at running for Senate. Dana Nessel, who is the current Attorney General, has said that she is giving it a quote serious look, end quote. And also there was some speculation about Garland Gilchrist running for governor, and isn't particularly well positioned to do so, just given the competition and that are already in place in the governor's race. And so he has indicated that he's quote seriously considering running for this open Senate seat, end quote. So being very direct about expressing some interest. A couple of members of Congress have, to me, kind of came out of nowhere in considering this. Both Hillary Scholten and Haley Stevens. So Hillary Scholten from the Grand Rapids area, and Haley Stevens from Oakland County, two members of Congress, both in swing-ish, kind of lean left seats, but not like heavy lean, that have both have indicated, at least to their supporters, are considering running. And finally, I'll say Senator Mallory McMorrow, a state Senate candidate, is widely expected to run for U.S. Senate. In fact, there's some indications even today that that she would probably get in pretty quickly. Now, on the Republican side, I think it changes in terms of the governor's race even more, because that seemed more wide open. So right now in the governor's race that we'll cover next, there's just a few people that are in, that we really believe are in. But but John James, who was widely speculated to be interested in running for governor, he's run for Senate a couple of times, and what he said in response to the retirement announcement, Senator Peters, brighter days are ahead for Michigan. And he has run for Senate twice in the past, against both incumbents before, but this would be the first time running as for an open seat. Mike Rogers, who just ran against, let's see, this was in Mike Rogers was in the race that we just got done.
The Slotkin.
Yeah, for retiring Debbie Stabenow against Slotkin, and that was an open seat. It was the closest election, Senate election in Michigan history. So he's said to be looking at it. Tudor Dixon, former gubernatorial candidate that lost to Whitmer in the previous election, 2022, has been considering it. Kevin Rinke, another one who ran it for governor in 2022, considering it, and a state senator named Jonathan Lindsay from the southwest part of the state, considering it as well. So no shortage of people. And really, it seems to be, I think, taking some of the pressure off the governor's race. That was really the main show in town before. So there are so many candidates that everybody thinks it's up for grabs right now. And so both sides are fielding a lot of candidates. I think at the end of the day, these will be pretty active primaries.
All right, so let's talk about 2026 GovWatch. And does this open Senate seat kind of reshuffle the deck for the hopefuls?
It does. I think there'll be significantly fewer people running for governor now, but still some heavyweights. And so looking at, so who do I consider to be heavyweights? If you look at the campaign finance reports, you'll see that Jocelyn Benson with between money that she has raised in various accounts that could be transferred into a governor's account, she's very well positioned to do so. Mike Cox, former Attorney General, from back 2002 to 2010, he put $1 million in an account to start it out running for governor, but hasn't announced yet that he's running for governor. Eric Nesbitt, Senate Majority Leader, who we talked about last week, that did announce, but his announcement came after the beginning of the year, so didn't have a campaign finance report due at this time. Probably the biggest support on the campaign finance front was Mayor Mike Duggan, who announced in December, but through the end of the year, it only raised about $63,000, which he's known for being a prolific fundraiser, but that doesn't necessarily translate. That was for when he was running for mayor. Does that translate to a race for governor? I guess we'll have to see. It didn't show up in his first report.
All right, well, that is the show we have for today. We appreciate you tuning in. Have a great week, and we will see you back here next Monday.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.